Hi, everyone. So typically, when we think about mapping cities, we think about roads and streets and buildings. I want to show you a new kind of map I've been working on for the last few years. This is a map of St. Louis, Missouri. Now, at first, you may wonder, well, how is it oriented? But I want to first say this is not a geographic map of any kind. What this is a map of people and a map of communities. Now, this is all of the Twitter users in St. Louis, Missouri. And you can see that there's sort of three major communities here. One here, and one here. And you kind of wonder, well, what are these communities? Well, it turns out we can identify them. And if you actually drill down and look at these users and see what the signal coming out of these different groups is, you find that this is kind of the mainstream civic sphere with like brands and bloggers and tech people, and all of us kind of geeky, Twitterish sort of people generally are over here. Then up here you have a group of primarily young white people interested in sports, things like that. And then you have a group here, which is by far the largest group in St. Louis, of young black people. And right down here, a little special group of East Side black people. Now, you may wonder, sort of what's in the middle here. The answer is nothing. There is no bridge acting between these black and white communities in St. Louis. And you can see sort of how this might be oriented. The folks down here are mostly geeks. These are sort of TEDx people, startups, things like that. And the people on this end of the network have basically nothing in common with the people on this end of the network. In fact, their position at the opposite ends of those poles indicates that they don't have any common friends that they're following. Otherwise, they would be closer together. So again, each one of these little dots is a user, and each of these wispy lines you see is a follow relationship. So we can actually verify the identities of these people by looking at their profile pictures. And if you drill in and look at these individual profile pictures, you can see that these are almost 100% young white people, and these are almost 100% young black people, and these are brands and other things over here. So this gives us the sense that we can actually use this data to try to understand how segregation works in our cities and in a place like St. Louis and, of course, Ferguson. Now, this is a map of Baltimore. This is where I live. And in December, I wrote a blog post on the TED blog that said that if we had a crystallizing incident, it would not be surprising to see exactly the same kind of violence erupt in Baltimore that we saw in St. Louis based on the organization of the city socially. And again, what we see is kind of the brands and politics and stuff over on this end. And then we have over here, which again is by far the largest group in the city, which is actually representative of the city's population of 66% African American, young African American folks. And the sports tend to act as a bit of a connector in the middle in Baltimore. The Baltimore Ravens, Michael Phelps, the Orioles, Under Armour, these are all sorts of things in that realm. So you can see that the morphology of Baltimore and St. Louis are quite similar, but they are a little bit different in that we don't have that gulf. There is sort of a connection there, but it's still extremely segregated. Now, what I want to do now is show you some different examples of other cities so we can get a feel for how these places are the same and how they're different. This is Istanbul, and for the last several months, I've been traveling around the world giving versions of this talk that are localized to a lot of different countries, so I've seen a lot of places, and I'm going to show you some of the more interesting ones. But here what you have is a really interesting phenomenon, and this is a little bit hard to read, so I'll read it. Young men, mostly frustrated young men, who really, really want girls to like them, and they write poetry to prove it. It's true. Now, in Istanbul, this is by far the largest cohort of people that you have in Turkey. Now, the interesting thing here is, again, you see this kind of geeky brands cohort up here, and then these young men down here, and then sports acting as a connector in the middle. These are sort of like the older version of these guys, it looks like. And then you've got the conservative ruling party over here. Now, this looks to be an army of sort of troll bots that are generating traffic in an effort to appear to influence these guys. We need to research that more specifically. But the other interesting thing that pops up in Turkey and in other places where the internet is censored is this here: sex generally and gay porn specifically. Now, the reason for that, I don't know if you've been to Turkey and tried to access any pornography, but if you do go and try to do that, you will find that it is blocked. And what you find is that people are turning to other sorts of mechanisms to be able to get access to that kind of content that people in normal societies would be able to get on their own. So at any rate, you really get a sense of kind of what's going on in Turkey. And a real question is, like, what happens to this cohort of people as time goes on? Do they become sort of part of this group, or do they move this way, or do they join ISIS? You know, and right now we're still trying to figure out how this looks over time, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the computational aspects of this and how difficult this task is. But let's take a look at Saudi Arabia. So similarly, you have kind of this spectrum that runs from liberal to more conservative up here. Two competing football teams segregated into 3 distinct communities. I'm not quite sure how that works. Again, you have the little island of gay porn and naked men over here. Because, again, censored internet, this is what comes up. So I think you can actually measure the internet health of a society by seeing whether the gay porn shows up on Twitter. And then prayers and advice, a little section over here. Teenage girls, they're probably not supposed to be talking at all, so they're talking only amongst themselves. That's why they're in a little island like that. And then some females down here, and then a little group of marketer poets up here, which seem to be people that are sort of monetizing the Quran somehow. I'm not quite sure how it works, but that's what my people who have looked at this have told me. Now, Barcelona looks sort of like a big fuzzy beach ball. And a couple of interesting things here to point out. One is which the Catalonian independence movement is very clearly visible here, as you would expect. Also, FC Barcelona is quite visible here. But the probably more interesting thing about Barcelona is that it is so round and symmetric. There isn't some very large group of disaffected minorities that's off on their own having a side conversation waiting to erupt into some sort of civil unrest. It's a pretty balanced society. You've got entrepreneurs up here, mainstream media, arts and culture and literature and libraries, very bookish culture in Barcelona that you can see here. And then some criticism on the left and some other writers up here. So it's a pretty balanced place relative to some place like Istanbul. San Francisco. Now, again, I want to remind you this is not a geographic map, so the fact that it resembles the peninsula a little bit is purely coincidental. But what you have here, if you've heard anything about what's going on in San Francisco lately, there's this huge influx of venture capital money. And so they're taking over the city. That's what we hear, And so they're all up here. They're sort of like a cancer growing on the top of the city. And then, here's everybody else trying to live their lives like they used to in San Francisco with food and arts and music and LGBT and sports and hip-hop. But no, these guys are totally geeking out up here. And you have Twitter employees that are so tightly identifiable as a group that's definitely them. Dick Costello is about there. And then you got a little group of gamers over here. So, you get a sense of kind of what's going on in San Francisco right now from looking at this. Now, this is another interesting one. I recently sort of said, well, in addition to looking at places geographically, I think it would also be good to look at the sort of followerships of key accounts. So Baltimore Police obviously has come up a lot lately, and I personally am very curious about sort of how their followership is put together. So I decided to go ahead and map that and really dig into it. And basically, it boils down like this. There's always, with police departments, sort of a group of other police departments that are following them. They're very interested in what's going on with police. There's always a group of really extreme right-wing activists that's sort of right there with them. The FBI is here, national media, and then sort of Baltimore media over here, and then sort of the mainstream sort of brands and newspapers and media and things over here. Interestingly, a little pocket of very clearly identifiable liberal artists, musicians, and hipsters over here, but that's definitely what they are. And then the Baltimore Police right here. And then young black Baltimore residents who are paying attention to what the police are saying because I think they want to understand what's going on and what the message is and all that. They may not agree with it, but they're tuned into it, which I think is interesting, and we'll come back to that in a second. And then there's another little group of young black Baltimore residents that are sort of on parallel with these guys, but these folks are very clearly white, these folks are very clearly black. So looking at the St. Louis police, just to see what the differences are, we can see that, again, you've got this sort of group of US police departments and FBI, I think it's right about there, far-right activists, national media, and then sort of hipsters, brands, I don't know what it is, people interested in beer and food or paying attention to the police a lot. And then Missouri politics, national politics, St. Louis sports, a whole bunch of sports-related stuff up here, and then another little pocket of young white Hillary Clinton fans. Interesting. But the key thing that's different here, and I tried hard to look for this, is that there is not a cohort of people that are young black people that are paying attention to the St. Louis Police Departments. And this is actually an aggregate of a few different St. Louis Police Department accounts. So it's interesting, that difference between Baltimore and St. Louis, in that there's at least some communication happening in Baltimore that doesn't seem to be happening here in St. Louis. So I thought this would be a fun one to look at as well. And we could go on and on with this, believe me. We could do POTUS and we could do Hillary, and to be honest, things like POTUS that I think has about 2.5 million followers right now, it's way too much data to crunch with the kind of techniques that I have available to me right now, and I'd love to expand that. If any of you want to work on that with me, please let me know, but yeah, could we maybe clear that? No, there we go. No, not quite. There we go. Please pause for this commercial interruption. No, in terms of capacity, it really is a huge amount of computational and data gathering work to run these things. So being able to map something like POTUS is actually really hard. So Bill de Blasio, this was sort of interesting. Probably the most interesting thing I found here is that these are all folks that, they're not like Italian ancestry people. These are people that live in Italy. And they're really interested in their boy de Blasio and how he's doing in New York. So they're tuned in, and there's a little special group here of Southern Italians from a very particular community, and I have no idea what this signifies, if anything, other than that they're just interested. But these folks are French in the middle here. This is a little lobe of people in London paying attention, and in the rest of the UK. And then, you sort of have other stuff that you would expect. New York City politics and media are here. New York agencies, various city agencies. Some other media and politics, like people that are involved in borough politics over here, and then national US political media and blogs over here. But this was interesting too. All the NYPD precincts are clustered in one side along with some right-wing activists. Interesting. You may have heard of Marilyn Mosby. Everybody heard of Marilyn Mosby, involved with the Baltimore police situation. So she has gained quite a lot of fame rather quickly, and I thought it would be interesting to take a look at what was going on with her. And so you have kind of this Baltimore politics and media crew, which were already following her before any of this news broke. But then all this other group appears to be much newer. So national politics, black politics and media, Barack Obama, CNN, black entertainment culture, so various artists and musicians, black entertainment in Los Angeles, and then a little group of very clearly identifiable black Muslims, which is interesting. And then there's sort of a group doing a black professionals directory in different cities that's linked to some of these people as well. So interesting, she's risen to fame very quickly. I thought it would be interesting to take a look at that. This one I also thought was interesting. The reason I picked this one is because he had not quite enough followers to be really problematic. It's not big data, it's like uncomfortably unwieldy data. So at any rate, I figured we could take a look at him. And this is basically how it breaks down. You kind of have an international group of Christian conservatives, and this orange group here is very clearly US religious conservatives, and then a group of US and Texas conservatives down here. And then some folks on the left over here, as well as kind of the normal cast of characters of the Republican right in the US. A little lobe of the Massachusetts GOP, and then interestingly, a little lobe of Texas energy bots. These are like bot accounts that tweet about different kinds of energy extraction, which I thought was interesting. And they're definitely clearly identifiable there. So what does all this mean? You look at things like this, whether you're talking about Tahrir Square or Ukraine, or Gezi Park or Hong Kong, or even some of the recent events in Baltimore and St. Louis. People have tended to treat social media as if it was a black box, that somehow or another, you could activate it and revolution would occur and it would be great, right? And to some extent, sure, it's enabled people to send messages out to their networks and to activate more people and whatnot. But frankly, they've lacked this kind of information. They've lacked these maps to help them understand how to cross boundaries out of their own networks and reach new people and get them activated around these causes that matter. And that is why some of these things have fallen short of our expectations. Now, why don't they have access to that data? Well, the companies don't make it terribly easy to get at, and some of them are not going to give it to you at all. Now, this is a map that I made of my Facebook network. And you may ask, is Twitter different from Facebook? The fact is you can make these kinds of maps with Twitter data, Facebook data, phone data, Snapchat data, whatever you want, if you can get access to it. I made this map late last year, and it shows pretty clearly what my personal network is, which is like Baltimore, TED, Silicon Valley, things like that. But you can't do that anymore. They've turned off the API calls to make this possible for you to even see your own network, right? This is a map that I made of all of the employers in Baltimore to try to understand how jobs work there. And basically it shows all the different employers linked together by employees that they've ever shared. So you can basically see from this, what your next job move might be based on where you're working now. And that clusters employers together by sector. So this is the education sector, finance, military-industrial complex over here, Baltimore Sun, media up here. So this is a really useful map, right? Well, as of May 2015, API calls to make this have been shut off. So let's take the case of Twitter in Turkey. Last March, President Erdogan in Turkey decided to turn off Twitter. And basically there were people saying things that pissed him off, so they turned it off using like DNS, so that's why you see the DNS hack there. But ultimately, they reached an agreement to turn Twitter back on, but there was a condition. The Turkish government needs to be able to basically erase any tweet that they find offensive, and they've erased thousands so far. Now, why did Twitter allow that to happen? Well, look at where their growth is. Their growth is in places where the internet is being censored, places like Saudi Arabia and Twitter. They could not afford to have a country like Twitter go dark because they're a public company and they have to report growth, right? So they made a compromise that says we are going to let people, let their message be censored in exchange for growth in that country. Now, we can get into the specifics of that, but a key point here is that, if we're going to allow these kinds of tools to be controlled in this way, we should be very careful about how we use them and how we're going to architect our future around them. So I got one more slide. If we can get the Wi-Fi message to go away. At any rate, I want to leave you with this question. What do we get in return when we click like? What do we get in return when we click follow? We just heard a great talk from Harold Feld about public utility. And I would argue that these sorts of tools are, in some sense, a public utility. And to the extent that this information exists and it can be used to do things like control the outcomes of elections, to influence people, to connect people for purposes of revolution and for organizing, this stuff can be used against us. And if we are not the ones that are using it, you can rest assured that someone else will. Thank you.